Barcelona lies on the Mediterranean coast in Catalonia. It's a gorgeous city, famous for architect Antoni Gaudí, artist Joan Miró, and writer Carlos Ruiz Zafón, among many others. Yet you'll find more than a few Barcelona ghost stories amid the winding streets and Gothic cathedrals. We're talking witches, vampires, astrologers, sorcerers, you name it, Barcelona probably has it. But this time, we're going to visit some vengeful monks, a haunted metro station, and go in search of a poltergeist in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with our European ghost stories this month with another city, and this time we're off to Spain and Barcelona. And I've been to Barcelona about 3 or 4 times now, and it's absolutely fabulous. And of course, while I was researching this, I was like, oh damn it, I wish I'd known about all these cool stories, because I would have wanted to go and visit pretty much all of them. So I will indeed be back. And Barcelona itself seems to have a lot of strange occult things attached to it, which I was a little bit surprised by. So you've got, as an example, Estruc Sacanera, an astrologer and sorcerer, was said to live in the Carrer d'Estruc during the 15th century. According to legend, he was a psychic and made predictions about the future based on the fact that he could hear people's private thoughts. And he also claimed to be a healer, using a dark-coloured stone and mysterious powders to cure both bites and rabies. The stories don't actually say how efficacious his cures were. And then in 1892, an industrialist apparently sold his soul to the devil in order to become rich because he was having money problems. When he then won the lottery, he celebrated by decorating his house with demon heads, as you do. And travellers would disappear if they stayed in the inns along Carrer de la Flor de Liri. And this, my friends, is just scratching the surface. So in this episode, we're going to have a look at 4 stories, and we're going to start off with La Boqueria Market, which is on La Rambla. Now, it actually stands on the site of a monastery for the barefoot Carmelites of St. Joseph, and by 1835 their lifestyle was apparently a little bit less regimented than it should have been, to the extent that they decided not to pray on their saint's day, and their saint being Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Now, one of the young monks was absolutely horrified by this decision because he was still taking his religious order seriously, unlike his compatriots. Now, the following night, on July 15th, which was Our Lady of Carmen's Eve, a strange sound woke the sleeping monks. They followed the sound to its source in the church, where they found a choir of skeleton monks. Their unholy hymns sounded like music not of this earth, but the monks didn't know what to do. Should they interrupt them or let them finish? Well, they decided to let the skeletal choir finish, which I can't help thinking was probably the right thing to do. And once the music died away, the living monks lit candles and then led the ghosts back to their tombs. When they got back to the monastery cemetery, they found all the tombs standing open and empty, and each skeletal monk climbed back into his tomb and then they closed behind them. Still baffled as to what had prompted such a performance, some of the monks returned to the church to see if there were any clues. Instead, they found the dead body of the devout young monk on the exact spot where the ghostly choir had been singing. And then 10 days later, a fire destroyed the monastery, killing the monks. Now, according to legend, people still hear ghostly singing and footsteps around the market on July 25th. So was the fire ghostly retribution for the actions of the lapsed monks? Possibly. That said, the Boqueria Market website does point out that riots broke out on the feast day of St. James and fire destroyed the Carmelite convent after that. So it could well be that the fire wasn't actually related to the monks' behaviour, but who knows? You never know. Now, our second story also deals with a building that was built on the site of a monastery, and it's also not that far away from the Boqueria Market. It's literally about 200 metres away. And this one's related to the Gran Teatre del Liceu, or the Opera House. Now, as I said, like the market, it does stand on the site of a monastery, and this time it was a convent of the Trinitarians. And, like our previous story, this particular monastery burned down in 1835 during a riot, and sadly one of the monks perished. In 1847, the Gran Teatre del Liceu was then built on the site. Now, the theatre actually hosted various forms of entertainment as well as opera and ballet, and people began reporting the appearance of a ghostly monk during parties. And he seemed to go around accusing partygoers of having started the fire that gutted the monastery. We can only presume this was the ghost of the monk who unfortunately died in the fire. Now, according to the legend, in 1861, a fire then destroyed the theatre, and the police actually found a note in the still smoking ruins that threatened to burn the theatre again if anyone rebuilt it. Now, nobody took that particular threat seriously because, I suppose in a way, why would you? And building work on a new theatre began. Flooding held up the construction, and people began to whisper that the site was cursed. Now, the theatre did manage to reopen a year later, but then in 1893, an anarchist bombed the theatre and killed 20 people. Everything seemed relatively straightforward until 1994, when fire once more consumed the building, and it seems that a spark must have hit the main curtain in the theatre during repair work, and the largely wooden building basically didn't stand a chance. Now, the theatre was rebuilt again, having this time been expanded to occupy a larger site, but the exterior is faithful to the previous one. Now, some people have wondered if another fire will strike. Is it the monk out for revenge for the destruction of his monastery, or is it the fact that the site was allegedly used for executions in the Middle Ages? Some people have said that one of those scheduled to die there may have cursed the place, and this curse may have soaked into the very earth itself. Now, it does make a good story, although I would point out that the Opera House's website doesn't actually mention the 1861 fire in its history of the building. It only mentions the one of the monastery that basically razed the site, and then the one in 1994. So, again, that one would require a little bit more investigation. Now, the next two are slightly more recent hauntings, this one in particular, and this is the Rocafort metro station. Now, building work began on the Barcelona metro system in 1924, and like underground systems elsewhere, including the London Underground, and there is an episode all about that, it does have its fair share of ghost stations, and these are essentially just stations that were built and never opened, or were sort of started and never finished. But it also has ghosts in the stations. And built in 1968 but never opened, you can sometimes see the platforms of the Gaudí station, which is one of the ghost stations. And you can actually see the platforms on line 5 between Sagrada Familia and Sant Pau dos de Maig. Now, the reason why this one's an interesting one is it's a ghost station, yes, but people have also said that they've seen people waiting for a train on the unused platforms, and this is clearly a train that's never going to arrive. So some people have then begun to believe that the Gaudí station must be haunted. Now, Rocafort is perhaps the most famous haunted station, and it's one that workers actually hate being sent to, particularly after dark. Staff sometimes see people wandering along the platforms on CCTV, but only after the station has closed. And if on occasion staff have then gone down to explain that the trains have stopped running for the night, they find the platforms completely empty. Now, the station certainly does seem to have earned its cursed reputation, because during the Civil War the space did provide refuge before it became part of the tube network. And a mudslide during its construction killed 11 workers, which obviously is going to create some kind of psychic disturbance in the area. But it also has the highest number of suicides on the subway network, and indeed suffered 4 suicides in 1 month during the 1970s. In another sad story, a child playing with a ball fell onto the tracks and was apparently hit by a train, and a medium once claimed to see a child on the platform playing with a ball. So it does seem that this particular station has had more than its fair share of sadness, so you can see why a lot of that would then congregate in the same place. But I think the very fact that people can see ghosts on CCTV that they can't see in person, that kind of thing we also see in the London Underground, particularly around Liverpool Street Station. And obviously, if you know London at all, you'll know that Liverpool Street Station is basically built right next to a plague pit. So I do think that having these sites of mass transit right beside scenes of tragedy probably doesn't help. And there are various ideas about the fact that transit systems are most likely to be haunted anyway because they're quite liminal. And obviously you'll no doubt have come across the word liminal, but it's just that idea of it's somewhere that's in between. So if you're on a train, you're neither at your start point nor your destination, you're in transit. And Mark Auger, the critic, actually calls these non-places. So they're not quite one thing or the other. And you would think it's an actual place because it has a name, in the fact that this one's Rocafort metro station. But it's also the fact that it's still not a place that you go to, you only ever go through it, if that makes sense. So I do think that if you add that to the horrible history of the place, you can see why that would then become a place for psychic disturbances and ghosts and so on. And I do apologise for the little bit of a tangent that I went off on there, but I will quite happily talk about ghosts and hauntings until the cows come home. And we're going to move on to the final one before I start going on about haunted tube stations again. And this is the poltergeist at 43 Francisco Giner Street. Now, the events at this particular address make it Barcelona's most famous haunted house, and it is also considered to be the location of Catalonia's first documented poltergeist case. And we've not really covered poltergeists on the podcast for one reason or another, so we're going to do it now. Now, let's zoom into the evening of 10th of February 1935. And the Montroig family sleep in their apartment while the family patriarch works the night shift. But loud noises wake the family, and the oldest son hauls himself out of bed to check the apartment is secure. As he moves around the apartment, the cabinet drawers shoot open and fall to the floor with a crash. Now this wakes up the neighbours, who call the night watchman, and he helps the family search the apartment, but no one can find the source of the noises. They suddenly stop, with silence filling the apartment. So satisfied everything is now as it should be, everyone goes back to bed. At which point the noises start up again. And the disturbances are still going by the time Mr. Montroig gets home from work. So confused and rather disturbed by his family's reports, he fetches the police. And like the night watchman, they search the apartment, but they can't find the source of the noises either. Everyone holds their breath the following night, fearful of another disturbed night's sleep. But nothing happens, and the night passes without incident. Big sigh of relief all round. Now, the family and neighbours assume it must have been a one-off, and they go about their lives as normal. But then the following evening, everything kicks off again, and the neighbours come into the apartment. Now, what they see shocks them, and the description of what is happening seems to be fairly standard across different websites, but essentially there's descriptions of lamps moving of their own accord, there's a chair that levitates when no one's actually standing anywhere near it, cutlery's floating through the air, and one of the clocks seems to go mad with its hands moving round and round regardless of what the time is. And it also gets worse. White shadows move in empty corridors, and the temperature plummets whenever they're seen in the building. Now, some of the versions that I read said that only the children reported seeing the white shadows, but then other stories claim that everybody can see them. So again, it's one of those things, who really knows what happened? But a sudden hailstorm covers the courtyard with ice, and indeed in some versions of the story that's actually stones. But either way, no one knows what's going on except something very, very strange is happening at this address. Now, the case ended up receiving media attention, as you can imagine something like that would, and the police had to post guards at the door to keep people away. But the phenomenon continued, only ending when everyone in the building moved out. Now, to this day, no one knows what was going on in that apartment. Some people blamed the Montroig's teenage son for the activity, and a lot of the websites do stress that he was ill at the time, but nobody really says what he was ill with, so I'm not really sure how they seem to think that he would have been capable of basically making chairs levitate and stuff if he wasn't well, but that seems to be the thing that a lot of people blame it on. And also, no one does seem able to explain the white shadows or the sudden hailstorm either. So it is a really, really interesting case, and it would be interesting to see if any of you heard of it and indeed what you make of it, or what you make of poltergeists more in general. But it is a very different type of ghost story than the ones that were covered in both Venice and Paris, where this one has a concrete date, it has concrete names, and it has got concrete things tied to it of what apparently happened during the incident. So it does make you think that something very strange must have happened, but obviously who can know what the happenings were for or why they happened. But they are the Barcelona ghost stories that I chose for this particular episode. And I do think it's quite interesting to keep these kind of stories in mind if you do go to Barcelona. Because if you stroll along La Rambla and it's this sort of beautiful broad boulevard, or, you know, if you go to have a look at the park where there's all the Gaudí stuff, or, you know, if you go to the Sagrada Familia, which you kind of have to if you're in Barcelona, or even if you go to tour the Camp Nou Stadium, which I did purely because my brother's a football fan. If you go to do any of the tourist things, just remember that there's this whole other side of Barcelona involving witches and poltergeists and ghosts and who knows what else. And it really does make the city come alive in a completely different way. So what I want to know is, have you actually been to any of these places? What do you make of them? Do you know anything further about any of these cases? If you do, feel free to let me know. You can post a comment on the YouTube video if you're watching it on YouTube. You can post a comment on the blog post that this episode is attached to, and the link, as always, is in the show notes below. But do feel free to get in touch and let me know what you think. We do have one more European city left, which is likely to be Cologne at this point, but we'll see. I'll have a look through the other places that I've been and decide which one it is that I'm actually going to do for the final episode in this theme. So I do hope that you've been enjoying it, because I've been quite enjoying doing the research for this, and I do like looking at ghost things. And speaking of ghosts, you say how good that segue was. I'm actually doing an in-person talk at Newcastle Castle about ghosts of the Garth, and that's the area around the castle keep. So we're going to be looking at ghost stories involving all manner of things, and indeed some of the really weird stuff that's actually happened at the Blackgate and Newcastle Castle itself. That is going to happen at 6 p.m. on 9th of June. And the link for tickets is in my bio. So that is an in-person one. But obviously it would be lovely to see some of you there. There is also the free online talk at 6 p.m. on the 29th of May. And obviously that's British time, in case anyone's wondering. And that one is about poisonous plants and their folklore. And the link to that is in the show notes as well. So it would also be marvellous to see you at that one. But anyway, that's me announcements for free talks and paid talks and things. Because obviously the Newcastle one is paid. I think it's £6. So it'll be really lovely to see you back here next week to have a look at some more European city ghost stories. And I'll see you then. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes. So if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.